Welcome to this week's episode of Being Human. I am here with Tom Cotton. He is the founder and program director at Mind Environment. He's an executive coach, a psychotherapist, and a psychologist. Tom, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Richard. Very good to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. And yeah, I'm fascinated to understand how you fuse these disciplines together and what seems to be a rather unique approach that you're taking to, I guess, what we might call coaching and development with the mind environment and the retreats that you offer. So I wonder if we should start, a little bit with the genesis of what it is, the genesis of mind environment and what it is.
Okay. So, broadly speaking, I'm a psychologist. And as you know, psychology is divided up into lots of different tribes. The humanists, the psychoanalysts, the existentialists, the behavioralists. And so the area of psychology that I have my roots in is psychoanalytic, but also slightly unusually an existential background as well, which is why I'm registered as an existential analytic psychotherapist. And before I began working in psychology, so before I did my master's training and then doctorate training, I worked in film for many years. And as a screenwriter, I was a music video director. And the aspect of story that I particularly loved was understanding the weave between the conscious narrative in the story and the unconscious narrative. And when you see great filmmaking, you see people who really understand that principle and how the two weave together and the significance of the major kind of thresholds in a story. And so that interest in that kind of weave between consciousness and unconsciousness has informed what I do now in the work at Mind Environment. And it's very much in there in my core interests as a psychologist. So the philosopher of science, Michael Polanyi, who wasn't an analyst himself, he was a polymath, a very interesting guy. But his maxim was, we know more than we can tell. And so his kind of equivalent of unconsciousness, he wasn't really sort of interested in the topology of unconsciousness like somebody like Freud or Jung might be. But he was interested in what he called tacit knowledge. So what's residual within ourselves that we know how to do, but we can't tell it because it's not conscious to us. So there's all this sort of the really basic operational stuff, like you don't have to tell your heart to beat or your digestive tract to digest, your lungs to breathe. Thank God, you'd be tied up all day running the body. But actually, when you start to kind of open that idea out, there is so much of what we do in terms of how we use tools, for instance, whether it's a computer or the tools of dialogue and interaction. And then when you start to get really complicated, how we use each other as people, how we build other people into our functioning. That's the bit that I'm really, really interested in. Because when you want to start examining what is it at the level of obstacles that is preventing me from doing whatever it is I'm trying to do, what gets in the way, to my mind, it's always down at that level. So deep level stuff that you have to kind of unpick to understand what is it in the world that I operate in that I've kind of incorporated into my functioning. And I have absolutely no idea what it is, how I do it. So that to me is a really fascinating area. And the work is essentially how do you get individuals, leaders and teams down to that level of functioning so you can really get in there and take them to a place where they can discover some really important insights. So it's about awareness development, because I think often the kind of the obstacles to awareness, they're kind of up here. You know, our minds are so cluttered with stuff. It's very, very difficult to see ourselves in the world clearly. So if you can get down to that level, you can achieve some really, really useful insights that help you to see where you are more clearly. So that's kind of fundamentally where all of those interests kind of weave together and kind of hone down into one area of focus. Right.
And yeah, and as I reflect on that, what we often find in the business environment is that we are looking at above the surface. What are the behaviors that we see that we'd like to change? What are the conscious thoughts that we have that we'd like to change? But stopping and reflecting, even just that, right? Even just stopping to do the reflection, to get a bit lower, a bit, you know, in the consciousness, let's say, is countercultural often. So I now I'm not starting to see why, and presumably that's the importance for you then of taking people away,
absolutely, into
a different environment.
Absolutely, because when we're in operational mode, you know, which we are most of the time, we have to be up at that level. You know, you can't do the deep level thinking all of the time. So you have to rest on all sorts of assumptions the whole time. You know, when somebody says something, I know exactly what they mean, and this is what I want instead. You know, that when we have a target, we have an agreed target. There's all sorts of assumptions that we're constantly relying on the whole time. That's very important. We can't operate without that. The problem is where it gets complicated is in the fine tuning. What kind of tends to influence choices is at that kind of below level aspect of human interaction. And particularly when you're looking at change process, a lot of the obstacles to change are down at that level. So everyone intellectually knows, yeah, we've got a plan, we've hashed it all out, this is what we're going to do, go. And then all of the obstacles that appear that get in the way, they're all down here at a level that you can't think about operationally. It just doesn't work. You get caught up here and you kind of end up spinning your wheels. So I think of it rather like, you know, when you lose your keys and you're in a hurry and you're rushing to the airport and you're a little bit panicked, you need the answer immediately. And all you can think about is, where did I put those damn keys? And you're kind of searching frantically. And that's a little bit like trying to find the answer through an operational lens. It's very targeted, and it comes with that kind of drive and energy. But actually, the irony is, it's usually that moment that you go, I give up, I can't remember the keys. You set off. And then as you're sitting back in the taxi and you go, bing, I remember where I put the keys. So when you let your mind start to roam outside of that kind of operational agenda, you start to see things differently. So that's one core aspect that I find that if you're trying to do a deeper level piece of work with somebody who's in the operational mindset, and they're answering emails and they're expecting, give me the knowledge as quickly as I possibly can absorb it, and then let's get on with, let's get back to work. You've got very little chance of doing the kind of the meaningful stuff that you want to do at the level that's really significant. So if you can get people outside of that mindset and just push all of that to the background and then create the conditions in which you can go deep, then you can find something really interesting and surprising down there.
Right. And I guess presumably what you find then is people have to take a leap of faith that those insights will come, right? Because it's not like you can say, by the afternoon on day one of this retreat, you will guaranteed insights in these areas, right? They've got to just jump and have some faith that there will be value in the process.
Yeah, and there I think you're kind of spelling out one of the difficulties of doing deep level work, because, for obvious reasons, if you're contracting with an organization, they want to know what the outputs are going to be.
Yeah.
And of course, it's necessary to have outputs, but if you're output focused right from the beginning, it means that what you're doing is you're creating another form of obstacle, really.
Yeah, exactly. And I find that's often a tension. Yeah, as you say, when we contractors and this kind of work, it's not possible to say, well, these are the things you will know at the end of this process, or these are the things that you will have learned. It's not about skill acquisition. It's not about knowledge transfer. It's something else.
It's something else. But I think actually one can transpose that learning into that framework, because there's the skills that one can acquire. I think there are a different set of skills. But for instance, clear thinking, enhanced creativity, better communication, better capacity to be honest. I mean, how much time is wasted in organizations because people cannot be honest with each other, because there's a real fear of what happens at the level of conflict. What are we going to get into if we talk about something that's actually it's too real? So there's an enormous value in it. And I think one can definitely translate it into outputs that are recognizable to an organization. But the thinking is definitely different. Yeah.
And so just talk me through like a typical journey then for somebody, because you do one of these in France, right? And one of these in Scotland. Like, just give me an illustration of the experience. I'm intrigued.
So the retreat experience, and I should say at this point, we've run one of them because for the last 2 years, COVID has prevented us from running any further. So we've got 2 coming up in France in April. One is a leadership retreat and one is a personal development retreat, which essentially the focus is, it's similar, but it's a little bit broader. So it's personal and professional development. So I'll tell you a little bit about the first program that we ran in France, which again, the focus was personal and professional development. So people came into the program with a challenge that they needed to work on. And for some people, that was a work challenge. And for other people, it was a relationship, a personal challenge. Actually, I think the reality is that there's a huge amount of crossover, because who you are as a leader is very much informed by who you are as a person. And the content and substance of our leadership program and personal development program is very, very similar, really, because you're working with people. As you know, given the title of this podcast, it's all about being human. So we run the retreat in this magical, quite unique village in the southern Languedoc. And what's unique about it is it's 16th century, and it was abandoned just after the First World War. And the current owner's stepfather discovered it, sort of hacking his way through the kind of the brambles and the undergrowth. And there was one person left living in this village. And so he took it upon himself. It was his sort of life's purpose to buy up the village house by house and restore it, with the help of friends, with the help of people who wanted to come, stay somewhere amazing for a week and do some stone masonry. And so he's been doing that he's died sadly about 10 years ago, but they continue his work, current owners. And so they've been working on it for about 50 years. So the village is privately owned, and it's in 100 acres of its own woodland, which in itself is within about 100,000 acres of national park. So it's about as wild as you can get in Western Europe. It's really quite extraordinary. It's up at the top of the mountains, sort of nestled into a little nook. And so the idea is, I love the place, so I find it transformational just being there. You feel like you've arrived somewhere very special, very different. And the first thing that you have to do is you have to switch off. Phone signal's not that good. Forget the internet. So you really have to switch off devices. And then you're just into a kind of a completely different mode. The atmosphere of the space puts you into a sort of a different rhythm. And so the first afternoon of the program is, it's really just about gathering everybody together, orientating them, briefing them on the work that we're going to do. And then we have a dinner on the first evening, so everybody has an opportunity to get to know each other. Because our contention is the group, as well as the facilitators, are the main receptacle of learning. So both in terms of the material that they're going to bring, and they are a repository of knowledge in terms of the perspectives that they're going to bring as well. So therefore, starting with a group who has some kind of sense of community because they spent a little bit of time together before you get into the work, I think is really important. I imagine that you've been involved in lots of sort of group training programs, either delivering or as part of your development. And, over the years as a psychotherapist and a coach, I've, done both, facilitated and taken part in programs. And what I notice is if you're going to ask people to go deep so that they can pull out this really important learning, you have to do it with kindness, and it has to feel safe and secure. And I have been part of group processes in the past where that really basic condition hasn't been met, and it can be. I guess I'm referring to that because I think that's often a concern that anybody has about doing deep work. How confidential is it going to be? How safe is it going to be? Is something awful going to happen that I won't be able to manage? So I've done group work in corporate settings. I've done group work I used to run a residential facility in London, and the therapeutic groups were never dull because we work with clients experiencing psychosis and forensic clients and substance misuse. So quite often there'd be somebody in the group who was high on crack cocaine, who was hallucinating, and it got quite lively. So the point being that handling a group in a way where everybody feels it's safe and it's secure and there's some kindness and some respect, really important.
Well, I just wonder if we could just pause there, because I'm imagining there may be some people listening and thinking, yes, the how question, how do we create that safety? It sounds like kindness is part of it. What else are you focusing on when you're seeking to create that safety?
So I think it's how you hold the conversation, and I think it's how you facilitate it as well. So it's the expectation that you create. So, and the culture is set by the facilitators. So if the facilitators sit back while, somebody's tearing into another group member and there's no attempt to digest it or put it back or reflect it, it can feel quite unsafe. So I think it's a lot about the culture that you create, and also briefing that in at the beginning. It's an expectation, and if you're coming here to a group to kind of work out your frustrations, then you need to think of the consequence of that. And I think that's a basic ethical question as well. If you're asking people to do work which involves them making aspects of themselves vulnerable, you have to give them that guarantee that it's going to be safe and productive.
Yeah.
So Richard, just looping back, shall I continue with this?
Yeah, you continue. Yeah, I just thought that maybe it was a question in my mind. It may have been in others.
I think it's a hugely important question, and it is what we brief people on at the beginning to remind them of that. And so the core of the program is 3 consecutive days. And we start pretty early. So there's a kind of a thematic symbolism. So we kind of structure it like a story, beginning, middle, and end. And the story begins with, we hike up the mountain at dawn and we watch the sun come over the mountains. And it sort of symbolizes this is a new beginning. And then breakfast and all of the kind of the functional stuff. And then every day starts and ends with a plenary group. So I would imagine you're familiar with that structure. So an open group, no agenda, but it's there purely to kind of surface what's going on in the group at the moment. What do we need to kind of take into consideration, checking in with everybody, where are we at? So you can just sort of surface some of the stuff that's starting to circulate in the group, but it's also kind of, it's a container mechanism because you're giving people the space to just talk about whatever it is that's on their mind. And then we go into the program proper, and we pose a series of questions, which we call elements, 10 elements over the 3 days, investigating different questions like identity, meaning, and purpose from different directions. But the way that we ask the question is we blend together a number of different approaches. So if I ask you, for instance, to tell me about yourself, and similarly, if you ask me, we'll both give a sort of a potted question, depending on the setting. It's either the kind of the social response or the business response. And we're sort of quite good at kind of framing it in the way that we want it to be heard. And it's almost like one sleepwalking, did I really say that? I can't even remember what I said, But if you ask the same question and you ask somebody to respond with a drawing, you'll get a very different answer. And then when you ask the group to comment on what they see in the drawing, you'll get an even deeper answer. And so it serves as bringing up quite quickly a different perspective that's unexpected. It brings the whole group into the conversation. And it brings the group with you to this deeper place quite quickly. So what we found by the end of the first day was we had got to a very deep place very quickly. And of course, with deep work, the risk is that you're bringing up stuff that's it's heated. There's the potential for conflict, for upset, and that's the jeopardy. And it's why I think it's definitely a difficult and skilled place to navigate. And I think it's why often people tend to stay away from it, particularly in leadership work, because there's a question about, can we go here? Is that possible? But what you find there, you clear away a lot of the gubbins and the obstacles really quickly, and you get into the conversation that you need to be having. And that's essentially the pattern that we follow after for each of those core 3 days. But a really important component is that we're mixing up discussion. So what we bring up through, say, drawing or through an activity, we then feed it into discussion. So it's constantly being processed. And the activities are kind of paired. That sounds rather like a food and wine menu. But the intention is to pair an activity with a question.
Okay.
So for instance, when near the end of the program, we're clearing the way for a new perspective. What everybody works on is clearing pathways. And it's just a lovely activity to focus on. And you're not thinking, what's the answer? You're focusing on what's the pathway I've got to clear. But it filters through. It's really interesting. And then when you need something quite meditative as an activity, we take people, for instance, on a 2-hour guided hike. And it's a really good opportunity for everything to just kind of settle. And then we do things like we ask people to bring back something from the activity that just resonates with their thinking. So the whole time And actually, it goes back to Michael Polanyi, the philosopher of science I was talking about earlier. He has a model that he calls vectoring between sort of different modes of thinking. And in essence, the fusion of the different activities is a way of getting people to vector between different states of mind. So now I'm being analytical, now I'm being open, now I'm observing emotion, now I'm listening, now I'm being creative. And if you can do that productively, then you kind of you create a much bigger body of knowledge than you do if you just kind of direct your head at something and hammer away at it, trying to find the answer.
Yeah.
So you create breadth and depth. And then every evening, really important activity, because we're in the middle of nowhere and we're in a forest, there has to be fire. That's really important. It's primal. And it's just lovely being able to have a fire, sit around it in this magical village. There's no street lights, there's nothing. It's complete pitch black outside as far as you can see. Stars, forget what stars look like when you live in a city. Yeah. And so the social aspect, the community aspect is really important because, again, we're sort of developing the strength of the group. They can really support each other. It's a really great vehicle for learning. And then at the end, we get everybody to piece together everything that they've learned from all of these different ways of thinking and piece it together into what we call a purpose map. So that's starting to bring this deep level stuff up. Now, what am I going to do with it? I've got to put it back together with the operational thinking.
Right.
So that last day is about fusing the two together so that people come out with a meaningful plan that they can execute. What was lovely about that first program was that we encouraged everybody to support each other with whatever plan they came up with. And 2 years later, they are still coherent as a group. They're in touch and they're supporting each other on each other's projects, which I think is wonderful. So there's a real sense of community. And then before departure on the final day, we debrief everybody. And then we have a group follow-up about a month later, and then one-to-one follow-ups with everybody. Because the other thing about doing deep work is you, as well as helping people to embed it, you want to feel like it's safe and that they've come through a real learning adventure, but that they can do something useful with it, rather than, well, that was really interesting, but what do I do with that now?
Right.
And it was a very powerful experience, I think, for all of us. We had a 2-year follow-up session just before Christmas, and 3 comments stuck in my mind. One person said that it was like falling in love. It was so intense. Another person said it was a spiritual experience because it was so intense. And one other person said, not that she's ever taken it, but she said it's what I imagine taking ayahuasca would be like. It was so powerful.
Wow.
And that just, I think, is fascinating that you can take people to...
Sorry, just to say, but I don't suppose there are too many leadership development programs that people would describe in those terms.
Well, do you know what? It's really interesting. I work with a guy.
Sorry, I now interrupted you, but yeah.
No. It's relevant. Richard, I work with a guy who's a chief investment officer in the Middle East, and he's really interested in ayahuasca, but it's quite risky. And so I think, actually, we ended up having a conversation about this program, but I think what's really interesting is, a drug like ayahuasca or any of the other hallucinogenic drugs is they can take you to quite a deep emotional place, and it's with us, it's there the whole time. What we're very good at as human beings is pretending that it's not there, but it's informing everything that we do. Depending on the statistics that you believe, there's a neuropsychoanalyst called Alan Shaw who talks about the processing speed of the conscious mind is a 60th of a second, but the unconscious mind. I know those are very sort of blunt terms. So a neurologist would say that they're more or less meaningless, given that the mind is such a complex integration. But if we just go with those basic terms, conscious mind 60th of a second, but the unconscious mind processes at 120th of a second. So in other words, twice the speed. So what's happening in interaction between people is you notice something and you think, well, I'm not happy, or I feel a bit defensive, or I like this person, or whatever it is. And you think that feeling has originated in you, but actually what's just happened is there's been 2 iterations already before your conscious mind thought, something's just happened there. I need to have a thought about that. So it's operating in us the whole time, that kind of level and intensity of emotion, but we're very good, particularly in organizational life, at suppressing it, which we need to do, because we need to focus on the operational. But there are times when we need to bring the two together so we can see clearly, so there's a more comprehensive vision. So I tend to think of it as, when you're flying at night, you're relying on your optical vision, but radar gives you this ability to see into the darkness. And ignoring what's happening at that level is like switching off your radar and saying, because I don't understand it and I can't communicate with it and it doesn't make any sense to me and it doesn't fit within the language of, what we do professionally, then, let's switch it off. So we're missing something, I think, really powerful that can help us to see the forces that we're trying to operate in more clearly.
Yeah.
And so I think powerful drugs like that, they key into something, but actually what they're doing is they're just keying into a natural process. And so again, we all have the capacity to go to that place and experience something immensely powerful. But you've got to structure it in a way where you can get people there.
Yeah, in a safe way. Because obviously the part of the trick of that, in order for somebody to feel like they've fallen in love or had an experience, they've got to be open and ready for it. They can't be too defended against the process, right?
Absolutely. But then thinking back to that first program, it was really interesting hearing the reflections 2 years on. Pretty much everybody said, I was scared. There was a lot of unknowns there. I didn't know how it was going to work. I wondered about the other people in the group. What were they going to be like? Were they going to be nice? Were they going to be, maybe I wouldn't, share anything in common with them. And there was, probably at least half the group, I think, at the beginning were very defended and presented a lot of obstacles. But that's group work. That's the nature of group work. That's what makes it so fascinating. And actually, the most offended person on that group was the person who I think gained the most from it. Because he said, I never knew it was possible to experience this depth of connection with another human being, which was very moving.
Yeah.
And he was somebody who was, very smart, run a very successful business, but very, very defended and holding a lot of fear and anger. And in letting people in, he let in this huge amount of learning. And he formed some incredible relationships with other people in the group who went on to become a great support to him. Yeah. I get one of the things that I'm finding interesting here is reflecting on the word you're using, learning. And that seems to be,
sort of, I suppose, a primary outcome here is people learning new ways to think and learning about themselves. And it's my projection here, but it's my script is because my experience of the deep work, I resonate much more with healing. It's about finding grief, getting to the tears, healing, the wounds and working, with trauma. And it's interesting for me that you're coming at this concept of deep work from a slightly different perspective. Is that conscious that your focus primarily is around learning, or, is healing part of this? I'm interested.
That's a really good question. Of course, healing is definitely part of deep work. I'm just wondering from which angle to come at that. So I think the starting point is awareness. So, as we sort of were talking about earlier, I come at this, psychological work from a number of different perspectives. So working with people one-to-one in psychotherapy or in coaching or group work, leadership work. And the common thread is always, this is where I want to be, this is where I am now, and there's something getting in the way, and I don't understand it. It doesn't make any sense to me. And it will be couched in different language. So whether it's somebody in a leadership position who's moving up a tier in the organization, having to take on more authority, big one, that's a difficult one, more responsibility, taking on more of the projections of the team that they're working with, because that's unavoidable. And there's something getting in the way of taking up that position of greater authority and responsibility, i.e., real leadership. Or, it could be, say, somebody who begins a piece of psychotherapy work and, there's some deep trauma or grief that's been suppressed that they can't access, whether it's something ghastly like neglect or abuse or something, the reality often is it's much more complex things that really kind of knot us up, get us stuck. And so I think that the basic question is awareness, and what is preventing my awareness from, what is preventing me from expanding my awareness so I can see what's really going on here. The problem is when we try to tackle questions, it's like that lost keys question. We just kind of knock our heads against that, where did I leave the bloody keys, And you just can't tackle that question in that way, because the awareness that you're trying to gain is it's all above surface. And actually, the answers to what is disabling your awareness, the bits that you can't see, it's all deep level stuff. It's all kind of knots at that level. And one of the things, one of the kind of the basic devices within our minds that stops us going there, I think, is ego. So we all need an ego because the mind falls apart without a muscular ego holding it all together. So it's not just the kind of the narcissistic ego that sort of dreams of, success and money and influence. It's the ego that literally just keeps the mind bound together because there's so many different parts of mind at play. And it's the ego that I think is the primary vehicle within our minds that stops us from hearing another person's perspective. So, tell me what you think. Blah, 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 blah. Okay, well, I'm just waiting for you to stop talking and then I can interject because what I think you're saying, in fact, I don't even care about what I think you're saying. I know what you're saying and I know what you're saying is wrong. I'm being really black and white about it.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to hear another person from the perspective that they're coming from rather than hearing them as a threat, as a fantasy about who I think they are and what they mean to me. And it's the ego that prevents that from happening. So I think a major significance of deep level work is that you just have to let go of all of that kind of, I'm in control, I know what's happening, I know what you said, this is, and you have to let go of that. And then the world starts flooding in and the revelations are immense. So then what you do there is, yes, it's healing if the healing needs to happen, but it's also creativity, it's connection with other people. It's experiencing yourself deeply and observing how you operate. And it's learning. You're learning, oh my God, this, all of this stuff that I always thought was there in my interactions with other people, why I'm defended is because everybody else has got a problem. And the learning is, no, it's me. It's me and what I'm making when I enter into this situation. So, like just a really sort of basic example of that. I'm not a particularly social person, so I always find parties slightly daunting. I think, what the hell am I going to talk about? You walk into a room and you're already feeling a bit, a little bit shy, a little bit defensive. You probably think, oh, nobody's going to find me particularly interesting. So you've already got your defenses up. And so your face mirrors what you're feeling. And you've got sort of quite a serious face. And so the first response, quite naturally, is you walk into the room and people kind of might flinch a little bit and they think, why is this guy? He doesn't look very happy, but he's a bit uncomfortable. Maybe he's going to say something that's kind of, a bit difficult. Well, you walk into exactly the same situation and you feel different. You feel energized. You've got a bit of a smile on your face. You're open. People sense it. And you couldn't say to, if you said, hey, everybody in that room, what does this person look like right now? They probably couldn't tell you. But instinctively, people pick up what's going on. So there's that kind of unconscious processing thing. Because, what we register at the level of the body, it's so subtle, it's so quick, it's so powerful. And so just in that kind of microcosm of a moment is an example of what you carry with you and how you embody it has a massive effect on the people around you. Everybody knows, a work situation where they've got, there's a senior person in the organization who's a real enabler, who's really good at listening, takes on concerns, they're creative, they give you lots of rope, try, you fail, they'll push you hard, but they're supportive and they can listen. And conversely, somebody in authority who micromanages, who's controlling, they project a lot of their anger and their frustration, feelings of alienation, and how the difference between those positions and how unproductive that can be. Because the knock-on effect is that people don't speak up, so they're not being creative, so you're missing out on innovation, breaks down communication within the team, people leave organizations. So this has real tangible effect on the bottom line.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was a
but I'm really seeing it now, and what you're doing is you're helping me to develop, I suppose, a broader understanding of what we mean by deep work. And I think that's, as I sort of laid out that question, really, it's because it's become synonymous with me for healing. And there's part of me saying, oh, for God's sake, Tom, but isn't the really important stuff to heal the trauma? Aren't you just sort of dancing around the elephant? And actually, I think what you're doing is you're helping to reframe this, that there's a much greater richness of experience that we can kind of understand as deep work that gets into creativity, questions of purpose, identity, and not all of those are trauma bound. I guess it's helping me to think more broadly and have a greater awareness of what having access to what's below the surface can bring for us. Yeah, so that's what I'm appreciating here.
Mm. Yeah, and I suppose trauma is sort of quite a specific word, and particularly in the leadership space, I think probably, and that's not to say that people in senior leadership roles do not carry trauma with them. The converse is true. I think everybody that I've worked with in a senior leadership position they carry with them difficult life experiences and hurt and damage, just like everybody else. But I think, there's a question about what is the focus of this conversation? What's the purpose of it? Where are we actually going to take it? How is it going to help me? What do I need to get from it? And I think trauma, potentially, it can be an off-putting word because, okay, so what does that mean? Are we going to do sort of primal scream therapy or something like that, rather than, I guess back to that question of, healing trauma might be part of the learning that one is doing. But at the most fundamental level, so the term mind environment, I come from a psychoanalytic and systemic background. It comes from the notion of, the way that we work, the way that our minds are wired, is it's like an environmental process. So we have emotions, we have thoughts, different forms of cognition, intuition, capacity to observe, to listen. From an analytic perspective, we have personality or persona and sub-personas. So there's a massive constellation of different moving parts in there. This is mind rather than brain. So what I've always been really interested in is how do you look at that as a kind of a system, and how do you make sense of the system?
Yeah.
When I work with somebody, particularly the sort of the deeper end of the work, it is what's always there at the beginning is you're bringing something that is not quite working. It needs to be updated. So in order to do that, we need to understand the system before trying to change it. So I worked with somebody for quite a long time who was in a senior position in TfL. And I was always so interested to hear about the updating processes of the transport network, particularly the underground. And you think...
And for people not familiar, TfL is Transport for London. It's the sort of, the transport
exactly.
in London.
Thank you very much, yes. When you think about it, the infrastructure is Victorian. So they're constantly updating it. And I think that's a little bit like, I think it's a good metaphor for mind, that the kind of the Victorian aspect of our kind of mental wiring is the sort of basic infrastructure that we started putting in place when we were a month old, a week old, 6 months old. And the architect of that infrastructure was somebody who couldn't speak, he couldn't even think, and didn't have the capacity to have thoughts. But they're shaping the way that they shape the way that your mind develops. And so, it's completely understandable, I think, that one reaches a point in life where you've got to go back to the design and you've got to do some rebuilding work. So you've got to start kind of replacing the Victorian tracks and the signaling system, and you upgrade it with, the newer, more functional, design fit for purpose mechanisms that you need in order for the whole system to operate. And the interesting thing is, I think, there are threshold moments in life that require that upgrade. And interestingly, there are moments in life, those threshold moments, where often if it's not handled well, you've got the capacity for something to go really wrong. So I think midlife is a really interesting phase. I'm not sure how old you are, Richard, but I'm past the half-century mark. So I'm well.
Really? You're doing very well? No grey hairs?
No, I've got enough on the sides. Thank you very much. So I'm well into that midlife question, and it's so interesting that the term that has always circulated is midlife crisis, and that that's when people go off and buy their red Ferrari or whatever it is. And there's an element of crisis because there may be a crisis of meaning or purpose, but actually it should be reframed as a midlife opportunity, because it's one of those, I think, those major kind of staging posts where you realize, I've come this far with this formula, with this mind, and for the next stage of the journey, I need to go back to the design level. And so that's where I think the deep work becomes really important, because it's not just a sort of a little bit of kind of tinkering at the edges and kind of optimizing. It's going back to the drawing board, but in a very managed and carefully controlled way.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. And that's the first time I've come across this idea of threshold moments, but yeah, it's a threshold, and it's like it can break either way, right? And often those threshold moments can be people spiraling, and that mind environment that we've built isn't equipped to deal with this threshold. Or if we're conscious about it and we adapt the mind environment, actually it can be an opportunity rather than a crisis. Like that, I really
absolutely. It's the reframing, it's the development work that we need to do in order to move on to the next level. Because one thing that you can guarantee about life is it's not static. It's constantly throwing new stuff at you, and some of it will kind of fit within your operational remit, and some of it will just completely knock you sideways.
Yeah.
But I think there are other threshold moments. I mean, I think, leaving school, university, that's the big threshold moment, or transition point, however you want to put it. Normally about kind of 8 to 10 years into a career is another big transition moment. It's usually when people are sort of starting to acquire a bit more expertise, authority, seniority, but they haven't quite developed the kind of the weight of experience that they need yet. And then that midlife piece, and then retirement piece. And then there's many, many in between, actually, kind of sub-transition points.
Yeah. And I think we can carry it over into organizations at large. And certainly what you'll find in organizations, they hit a blocker in the market, or they find their business model isn't working so well, or something happens and they have a threshold moment. And what comes to me as you're talking is that the executives in those companies that then often rely on those very narrow thinking tools, if you like, and it's about, well, how do we redesign the organizational chart, and what do we need to do with our financial model and so on, and they tend to resist falling into sort of deeper work and allowing themselves to expand awareness and try different ways of thinking and styles of thinking, in order to re-architect the business.
Absolutely, and as you suggest, that's the moment where it's needed. And there's something interesting, I think, going on with anxiety at that point, because we're kind of anxiously searching for the solution. And that anxiety can get in the way of doing the deeper work that's needed, that instead of being kind of pinpointed, you're opening out and you're starting to consider everything.
Yeah.
So the way that I put it is that it's less sharpening the tip of the spear and looking at, is the spear the right tool for this job?
Right. Yeah. God, I can tell you're a screenwriter. You're great with kind of metaphors and imagery. You've always got one there. It's great.
Well, I mean, that's the really interesting thing about story is the story is metaphorical, but I find it a really psychologically true medium, and it's why we spend billions of pounds every year digesting story material, because we're constantly, in watching and viewing, we're constantly reviewing and learning about the human journey. And if you look at a great piece of screenwriting, it's deeply, deeply, deeply psychological. It's somebody who really understands human psychology. So I always contend that story, particularly screen story, and I'll come back to that in a second as to why, is group psychology in action. So it's the psychology of transition. It's all about how to handle transition. Look at any story. You can learn so much from it. The reason why screen stories, I think, particularly can teach you a lot, and given that often screen stories are adapted from stories on the page, but they're a very particular kind of medium. So whereas with a novel, you can be as long as you want. You can be 100 pages, or you can be War and Peace. And you can see inside people's heads, you can hear their thoughts, their interpretations, and you've got no limit on the budget. It could be Siberia, it could be the North Pole. But as a screenwriter, you've got these really severe limitations, which is nobody's going to watch your 15-hour epic, unless it's a Netflix epic or something like that. But, the unwritten rule, unless you're a major director, is you've got 90 pages of script before the audience leaves the theatre. And it's all to do with the kind of the mechanics of the business. You're going to put on 2 or 3 screenings a night. It can't be a 2.5-hour epic, that kind of thing. So you've got 90 pages to tell your story, and you can't see inside anybody's heads. You can't hear their thoughts. So you've got to externalize everything that's being felt. You've got to externalize the journey through imagery, through metaphor, through subtext, through dialogue. And so therefore, it's a really psychological medium. I can think of several novel writers who've written about, they've written screenplays and they would never go near it again because it's so hard. So you have to draw into service storytelling off the page. So through what you suggest, through genre. Genre is a really interesting thing because your genre is really, it's a kind of an alluded to story. When you see a gunslinger walking down a street towards a saloon, there's a whole narrative that opens up without having to tell any story at all. And so this is why genre is so important in filmmaking, because you bring with it this whole story world that's attached to a genre. And then when you fuse genres and you get working against each other, always remember, who was it? With film critics who called Alien Truckers in Space. It's brilliant because that's what that movie is. It's a horror film about truckers in space. Anyway, that's a bit of a digression, but
I can start to see how this is informing your work, because it seems to me that when you take people on these experiences, that the mind environment experience, that you're having them externalize, right, through picture, through metaphor, through sort of self-revelation, and in a sense that they're sort of narrating their own, maybe this sounds too cliche, but their own movie, right, as they go through this experience.
No, absolutely. And we collate all of the imagery that we gather during the course of the program. And it's literally a story that unfolds. And going back to that Polanyi quote, Michael Polanyi, the philosopher of science, we were talking about earlier, you discover you know more than you can tell. You draw something, somebody else sees something in the drawing, and you go, bloody hell. That's just been in my mind somewhere as an unexpressed thought. But now that I see that thought and I see it in front of me in writing, that's an unbelievable revelation. So yeah, storytelling.
Yeah, and I wonder if you've done any thinking, because something that's crossing my mind now, and there may be other people thinking this, is that it's all very well if you've got the opportunity to go off to the depths of France for 3 days, but if I've just got 2 people in a boardroom, 2 hours in a boardroom, I've managed to get that far, and I've got a space where I've got the potential to do some deeper work. Are there like a few principles that people can consider applying that might improve their chances of getting to a greater level of depth with a group?
Time. It's a journey. You're making a journey, and you can't get from here to here in 30 minutes.
Yeah,
if you're going to do it safely. I mean, you can. The CIO that I was talking about earlier, where we've had several conversations about his interest in hallucinogenics as a way of sort of getting to something more fundamental. I call it his desire to take a howitzer to his brain. It's trying to smash this sort of great big hole through a level of consciousness, and that causes trauma. So you can get there. I mean, if you got into a punch-up with somebody, you'd be in that place pretty quickly. But you don't want to do that. That's destructive. And obviously, when you go deep, it's not all about aggression or conflict. It's about lots of very profound things. But I think if one tries to do it too abruptly, you're not doing it in sort of a carefully managed way. You need time to get there. You need to be able to switch off that anxiety, just keep it at bay, and then time to get deeper and deeper down to the level that you need to kind of operate in. And then you need time it's like deep sea diving. Not that I've ever done it, but you come up too quickly, you come up with the bends. Maybe that's a terrible metaphor, I'm not sure, but
I know.
But you need time to come back and then put it all together and do it constructively.
So time is one. Providing enough time.
I think, is absolutely, and it's the thing, of course, that everybody doesn't have.
Yeah. Well, depending on the nature of the organization, and that's what's fascinating about doing this podcast, of course, is where people have consciously designed organizations that allow for much deeper thinking and take away a lot of the drivers of this sort of, I suppose, modern form of doing business, which is very busy. People do have time, right? So there's a couple of guys who I've invited onto this podcast who are the CEOs of organizations, and I say, when do you want to come on the podcast? And they're like, we'll pick a spot time in the next 3 months. My diary's free. So I think what's interesting is one can create organizations where there is time, but often the organizations that need this depth of thinking the most are exactly those organizations that have such a paucity of time.
Well, absolutely, yeah, it's a very good point. And if you're in a real hurry to get somewhere quickly, it means that you're probably unlikely to allot the time. It also means that you're not going to do the meaningful thinking. So, if you allot the time, you do the meaningful thinking, the value of what you pull out of that is going to be, worth so much more than shorter space of time, but insufficient thinking.
Yeah. And I think that's behind a lot of this movement, the no meetings Monday or no meetings before lunchtime. And I think people are starting to tap into this and understand that we've got to start restructuring our days, restructuring our organizations to honor this, these deeper capacities that we have as human beings.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I think it's a very good point.
Yeah. Anything else you'd offer other than time as a principle for deep work?
Well, I think going back to that question of how you frame it, so expectations, briefing, that we're going to be working in a different way and it's going to feel unfamiliar. And it's going to feel a bit unknown, you'll feel a bit disorientated. And making sure that the structure that you're building in is a safe structure. I suppose as an analytic practitioner, I'm always trying to think, what's the unseen stuff here that I haven't thought about? So, this is what everybody's saying on the surface. Yes, we're happy to do this. No, we don't need to do that meeting. That's fine. We can contract in this way. but actually looking out for, what am I picking up here beneath the surface? That means what I really need to do is this. I've got to build in quite a careful structure here. I'm looking out for this, that, or the other. And just being really thoughtful, reflective and mindful of what you're getting into. Given that every action, I think is, every action and interaction is a kind of, is a revolving door threshold. So you kind of go through it, think I'm heading for the lobby that way, but actually it kind of shoots me out in the other direction and I'm somewhere completely different. What we all meant was that, but what happened was that. So why, so just building in structures where you can kind of handle all eventualities and be thoughtful about what's happening as it's happening.
Yeah. Being responsive to the moment, which comes back to the safety, where if you're not in a position where you can kind of respond to what's emerging and deal with it such that you maintain safety, it's potentially going to be, you're going to be in a difficult situation. Once people stop feeling safe, that's it, isn't it? You've lost
absolutely. It's a difficult one because you need an element of risk. There's a lot of excitement there too. I think it's an extraordinary adventure. Because when I take part in group processes, I feel that kind of natural resistance. Oh God, I don't want to go there. That feels uncomfortable. I don't want to kind of open myself up. I don't want to be vulnerable to criticism. But I always know that once I take the leap, that I'm going to come out of it with something really, really powerful. So it does involve a bit of a risk, I think, necessarily, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. That's where the growth, the learning comes from, the growth comes from. It's being willing to take that risk. And maybe that goes back to the expectation setting here, is that there's an implicit request here for people to take a risk. In order to have the learning.
Absolutely.
The expansion.
Risk, adventure, learning.
Right. A bit like falling in love, a bit like taking ayahuasca, right? It's
absolutely. Or what I imagine, because I've never taken out ayahuasca. I would be far too scared to do it. The closest I ever got was in my early 20s taking LSD, and that was not a place I'd want to go back to.
Yeah, I'm the same. I've always been. I've never taken. Well, I have taken. I've had an experience with weed, which was mildly hallucinogenic, but I've never consciously taken a hallucinogenic per se.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Well, this has been a wonderful conversation. I've learned a lot. It's given me a different appreciation for what we mean by deep work. The importance of narrative, consciously thinking about narrative. In the work that we do.
Well, it's been really interesting. And we said at the beginning, we weren't sure how long we were going to talk for. And I'm not sure how long we've been talking, but I think it's a while, maybe an hour and a quarter or something like that.
Yeah. It's been well. We've used plenty. We've given ourselves plenty of time, Tom.
Yeah. Well, I think it's needed. I mean, going back to that theme of time. Time is what's needed if you're to allow something to kind of unpack and unfold. Time is a precious commodity. Well, Richard, it's been great meeting you. Really interesting. Thank you so much for having me on your podcast.
No, thank you. And I know you're about to go off skiing. So have fun with that. And to remind people, so have you still got availability on? I think you've got retreats coming up in. Did you say April?
Yep. So 24th to the 28th of April is our leadership program, and that's in Bardoux, the wonderful, magical wilderness village in France that I was telling you about. And then the what's called the individual program, which is personal and professional development. So slightly broader focus is the week after, and that's the 1st of May to the 5th of May. And whereas the leadership program it's a group of people in leadership positions, senior leadership positions, the individual program it's more mixed, and could also actually be of interest to coaches and mentors and anybody working in development. It's a self-development program. In fact, on that first program, we had one person who ran a coaching business, and another person who is a psychotherapist.
Yeah. Well, it sounds very appealing to me. I'm not sure I'd get a pass right now with 2 4-year-old boys to spend a week in France on my own. But I'm sure that would appeal. Wonderful. Okay. Well, we'll certainly put links to the Mind Environment website so people can sign up there.
Lovely. I'll send you links to the programs as well, actually.
And the programs, especially. Yeah, we can do that. Anywhere else you might point people who found these topics interesting?
Gosh, that's an interesting question. You mean some reading or
reading, or anything that just comes to mind? Is there any other resources you've found on your journey that have been particularly valuable that you think people might want to check out? Or maybe it's all there on the Mind Environment. It's just a thought.
That's a really, really interesting question. I mean, some of it's there. Well, it's on my mind at the moment. It's probably not that relevant, but I just finished reading the most wonderful biography of Nietzsche, the philosopher, by Sue Prideaux, I think she's called. It was, I think, one of the funniest books I've read for a long time. And you wouldn't
expect you to say funny.
No, she's just such an acute human observer. But Nietzsche's work is, the man was extraordinary, disturbed, troubled, but visionary, much misunderstood, thanks to his rather unsavory sister who took over his legacy and sort of remodeled his work to a kind of a more put absolutely plainly, she was anti-Semitic and had started an anti-Semitic colony in the Americas, and Nietzsche was so disturbed by her behavior that he cut off communication with her because he loathed anti-Semitism. And unfortunately, she then took over his legacy and rewrote a lot of his work.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, absolutely. But he's a fascinating thinker. So I would suggest reading that book.
Right. Okay, good. Well, we'll put a link to that book. And I know I've not studied him, but I also understand he had a dark side, right? There was.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, good. Well, we'll put a link to the book. And thank you very much once again. Thanks for your time. Thanks for sharing so openly about how you work and this approach. It's been fascinating.
Absolute pleasure. And lovely hearing more about what you do as well, Richard. And I hope we speak again.
Sure. Yeah. I hope so. And enjoy the skiing. Thanks, Tom. Cheers. Right.